Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Drs. John Holman and Augustine Obour. Cover crops have a lot of uses, depending on where you live and what you grow, but in some regions, like the Great Plains, it can take a little extra help to make sure they're as helpful as they can be. In this episode, John and Augustine join me to discuss the advantages and challenges of grazing cover crops in the Great Plains. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we wanted to thank our sponsor for this episode, EA Consumables. EA Consumables is the exclusive U.S. distributor of organic elemental analysis products by UK laboratory supplies manufacturer Elemental Microanalysis. Visit eaconsumables.com for high-quality elemental analysis consumable supplies that offer performance you can trust. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today we have Dr. John Holman and Dr. Augustine Obour with us. John is a professor in the agronomy department and serves as the cropping systems and forage agronomist in Western Kansas. John earned a bachelor's degree in agronomy and agriculture business and a master's degree in weed science from Montana State University and a PhD in plant science from the University of Idaho. From 2002 to 2006, he worked as a research and extension scientist for the University of Idaho. He joined Kansas State University in 2006. Dr. Holman's research program is focused on integrated crop livestock cropping systems, dryland crop production, cover crops, and increasing water use efficiency to improve sustainability and profitability. Augustine is a professor of soil science at the Kansas State University Agricultural Research Center in Hays. A native of Ghana, Obour earned a bachelor's degree in crop science from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. He holds a master's degree in agronomy and a PhD in soil and water science from the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. His expertise is in soil and nutrient management issues in semi-arid dryland cropping systems. A major emphasis of his applied research program is focused on developing a systematic understanding of soil management and agronomic production practices within dryland cropping systems and the impact of such practices on soil health, water use, crop productivity, and economic returns. Augustine's current research projects are focused on understanding the interaction among tillage practices, cropping sequence, cover crops, and their impacts on crop yield, nutrient cycling, and soil health. His international research activities are focused on sustainable intensification of dual-purpose cowpeas for enhanced food and fodder production in West Africa. Hello, John and Augustine. Welcome to the show. How are you both doing today?
I'm doing well.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, we are so happy to have you. So we are talking about cover crops and specifically grazing's interactions with cover crops. I know you both have done a lot of research with this with a lot of other professionals in your field. So to get us started, can you just go over on a high level kind of how this process works, what time of year, the time limit, types of crops? What are some of the kind of potential benefits one might expect from this practice, as well as just areas of concern?
Sure. I'll start and Augustine will correct me. We started this work initially, and I think a lot of others, trying to make better utilization of our limited precipitation. And during that fallow period, we have found that integrating forages and cover crops grown as forages has that potential to allow us to intensify the cropping system, yet increase soil cover by growing a crop, and by integrating livestock, we can increase the profitability of the system. Whereas if we just grow cover, quite often we lose financially. That's less profitable than if we were to grow something for forage and get some use from the livestock. So, depending on where you're at in the country, you asked where it could be grown in the rotation. Well, there's lots of options. It just really depends on where you're at in the country and what your cropping system rotation is. But, you can grow a spring crop, such as spring oats or spring barley. A summer grazing crop could be something like Sudan or sorghum Sudan, millet. And then the fall planted winter crop could be something like winter triticale, winter rye would be some of those types of options.
Yeah, and I think John has covered that nicely. So depending on where you are, you can plant a spring cover crop, graze it towards early summer. That's what we do in most of our research, do spring planted cover crops. But we also done summer cover crops that you plant immediately after a grain crop is harvested. So that is kind of the production systems that we are working in. And some producers also grow this in the fall, and then they graze the cover crops in the winter. Then they terminate the cover crop early spring, and then they plant it to the field to a row crop. So depending on the production system, you can put the cover crop in as part of the production system as a rotational crop.
Yeah, sure. That is a great overview, helps give some good context for the rest of our conversation. Just a reminder for anyone who's not familiar, cover crops are kind of like crops you grow in between kind of your more cash crops for a variety of different reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into here a little bit more. And then this is, I'm assuming, since you're both in Kansas, is kind of mostly in the Kansas area. Is it out a few states from here? Is this very local to Kansas? I know oftentimes the practices you use will vary quite a lot depending on where you are. So what region is this kind of appropriate for that you focused on?
We started this research in 2006 here in Western Kansas, but there's been some other studies in the Southern Great Plains, Oklahoma, Texas, and Northern Great Plains up into Montana. And, the whole Great Plains is kind of a somewhat similar environment, that it's moisture limited, and there's a lot of livestock in that region, and so there's the opportunity to integrate the two. But the cropping rotation, the crops grown, the system varies north to south. Where we're centrally located, it kind of has applicability both to the north and to the south of us. But if you go back in time, there was actually some cover crop work done in the research done in the early 1900s before we started using conventional fertilizer sources. So those were legumes species. There was an interest in the 80s of green manures, but more recently, we've been doing our work, has been this increased interest of integrating livestock and cover crops.
And a lot of this is kind of directed towards the opportunity growing a cover crops in some of these NRCS or government programs where cover crops are being grown. But we've seen that even in places where they have more moisture, they tend to have an impact on the subsequent crop yield. So producers are growing this and looking at how they can make it work. So the grazing component started recently with the intent of trying to get some economic benefit from these cover crops. So there is a lot of interest in growing the cover crops but making it work. So grazing is kind of one of the ways that you can make it economically profitable.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like cover crops are so interesting whenever they come up because there's often this, are they helpful? Are they not? There's a lot of nuance depending on what practices you pair with it. So I'm excited to dive into that. Speaking of, you had quite a few kind of general areas that you were covering in this review, kind of gathering what has been done already in this research. So the first area is in livestock forage. So if you could just tell me about how pairing those is helpful or some challenges that might be faced, that would be great.
I'll start, I guess. One of the things in moisture limited regions and highly variable year-to-year precipitation, the cover crop biomass grown, the forage production can vary greatly. We could have an extremely dry year where there'd be almost no production, and we can have a real wet year where the biomass yield potential could be maximized. So we have that high variability, but on the same token, we also have whatever our base forage is, that's a native pasture or those types of things, that too is highly variable. And so by combining cover crops with forages, we can utilize cover crops to help produce that forage need and fill that demand when native range is not available.
Yeah, and that is very important, especially in the last couple of years where we have a lot of drought. So most of our native patches are struggling to put on tons of biomass, right? So sometimes you grow these cover crops, some of them tend to do well. And then in that case, you have available forage that you can use for livestock, and then you rest in these pastures to recover from this prolonged drought. So that has been very helpful to some of our farmers that are growing and grazing these cover crops. But like John mentioned, the productivity varies a lot. So in our own work, we've seen yields in our environment ranging from about 1,000 pounds per acre or even less to almost 5,000 pounds per acre. So that creates a challenge, right? So you want to graze this, you don't know how much you are going to produce at the beginning of the year. So if you have cattle, what are you going to do? John can provide more insight on that, how to manage this. But I think that is a problem for some of our producers. You have high range in productivity. So how are you going to manage your stocking rate to take advantage of grazing these cover crops?
Yeah, an example to try and help demonstrate how the two can work together, growing cover crop and also fit in with that precipitation variability. For example, if you have a winter triticale or winter rye growing, and that gives us good grazing potential through the fall into the spring of the year. If we have a real wet environment, we may be in our native range, we could have a lot of cool season grasses growing, and we could have ample forage available to turn cattle out on native range. But in dry years, it would be best to not turn cattle out on that native range and to let that native range rest a little bit. Well, if we have a cool season cover crop growing, we could graze that cover crop in those dry years, rest that native range a little bit, and help with that native range. But in a wet year where we have an abundance of forage, we could actually put up that winter forage crop either as a hay or a silage crop, and bank that forage, because the next year could be a real dry year, and then we would have that forage available in that dry period. We'd have that extra forage available to get through that dry period.
Yeah, I was going to mention about the quality of some of these cover crops. Essentially, most of these cover crop species are annual forages. So most of them have very good forage quality. Even the grasses tends to have more than 12% crude protein, and digestibility is also very good. So these are very good forage resources. If you manage it very well, you can utilize this to feed your livestock.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up about like the management of it and like the nutrition, because I was going to ask, if you have like both available, how do you choose like where to send the cattle? Is it something where it's like half and half the time? But I'm glad that you mentioned some of these other environmental variables of, the moisture that might impact other plants that might be available. I'm certain, compaction is something to think about if you have heavy animals going through your fields to a certain degree. So I'm really glad you brought that up. And then I had another point under here that mentioned you also looked at kind of like the economics of this use for the cover crops. I know certainly if you're getting kind of variable mileage depending on the year, that's certainly a factor. But what else is helpful or harmful to this practice?
Sure. One of the things that we've found is in our highly variable environment is that to have some flexibility in that management. And so what I mean by that is we've had some extremely dry years, thinking back in recent history, we had 2021, 2022, prior to that 2011 were some extremely dry years, and we had in those years there was no soil moisture available to get a cover crop established. And actually, if you were to try and seed a cover crop, you would destroy what little residue you may have and make the soil more susceptible to blowing, and Augustine might speak to that more. So in those years, we found it's best to fallow and not plant a cover crop. And so what we have defined that as is a flex fallow concept. So we're trying to crop a little more intensively when the environmental conditions allow. And if it's extremely dry, then we crop less intensively to try and conserve what wet residue and bank what soil moisture we may have until conditions improve for planting that cash crop. Economically, we've done a lot of work on that, a lot of sensitivity analysis, a lot of work. We've almost been doing this work for 20 some years, and there's been some others that have found similar results that we have. If you're in an area, plentiful rainfall, you can crop more intensively without having to worry about the negative consequences to that subsequent cash crop. But in the moisture limited regions of Great Plains, we need to be aware and cautious that maybe by growing that cover crop, we could potentially reduce the following crop grain yield. And so that cover crop then has got to make up for the cost of growing the cover crop and any potential negative yield impact on that subsequent cash crop. And so in doing that, we have found it's really best if that forage, well, back up a little bit. First of all, we've compared a lot of things. We've compared just standing cover, looking at, we do get a little bit of benefit from the increased weed control. So maybe you can save one herbicide application, but that's never enough to make up for the cost of growing the cover crop. What we have found is really you've got to integrate the livestock into that, whether you hay that cover crop or graze the cover crop. We've actually not seen a difference in the soils. Soil properties following either haying or grazing, they're similar and they're improved compared to fallow only. And we need to generate about 2,000 pounds of dry matter per acre to pay for that cover crop. The other thing that we have found in our work is that anytime you spend a lot of money on seed, so exotic species, and especially those species that not produce a lot of biomass, that also can make that system not cash flow. So you need to grow what we have found is you need to grow something that produces significant amount of biomass and fairly low seed cost. And we have found monoculture grass species to be the best economic choice, and we have not found an advantage of growing complicated mixtures or cocktails as compared to a single species.
Yeah, like John said, so because of potential to decreasing yields, grazing the cover crops to us has been more economical. Some of the work that we have graduate students working on this, done some economic analysis, and we've seen that grazing of the cover crop or utilizing it for forage as a hay crop always is more economical than growing it as a true cover crop, just not using it for forage. Also, the seed cost is very, very important. If you grow a high mixtures like 10 species mixtures, the productivity is not as high as you grow single species co-season grasses or having a simple mixture. So what we found is the economics is directly related to how much biomass you can produce. So if you have a simple mixture that is producing more biomass, then you have more biomass available for grazing, and that increases the economic returns compared to growing several species. So our recommendation is you don't grow more than 5 cover crop species mixture. If you can grow 2 species that works for your environment, that is better. But don't go too overly excited to be growing a lot of mixtures, because you wound up having about 2 species that will be dominant in your cover crop mix after you get it planted.
Sure.
Well, I'd go so far as to say, don't be concerned to grow 1 species and grow it like and manage it like a crop. You can then do a better job also from a weed control standpoint. If we think about some problematic weeds in our area is kochia or redwood pigweed or palmer amaranth. Those species can be a real problem. So especially the kochia and the palmer amaranth. And if you are growing a grass cover crop, we have herbicide tools available to manage those species. But if we grow a broadleaf in that cover crop mix, now we don't have any herbicide tools available to control those weed species. And a lot of the work, and Augustine, you can touch on that, but a lot of our work, is improving soil quality, so organic carbon, aggregate stability, is growing a cover crop that produces a lot of biomass. And so growing a single mixed species, winter triticale, for example, or a sedan for warm season crop choice, that will generate more tonnage, cash flow better, and have better results on soils than a complex mixture that doesn't produce as much biomass.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? John and Augustine's paper, Grazing Cover Crops, How Does It Influence Soils and Crops?, published in Agronomy Journal, is always freely available. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsor, EA Consumables. What kind of soil standards does your lab need? Loamy, clay, peaty, chalky, silty? EA Consumables has a new line of synthetic soil standards from Elemental Microanalysis, which offer superior consistency between batches for improved analysis results. These synthetic soil standards are made from pure mineral and chemical ingredients. Visit eaconsumables.com for more information. Thank you again for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. I really enjoy this research because I feel like economics to me as a person is usually just sounds really complicated and overwhelming. And this puts those kind of decisions in a context that is really fascinating and kind of interesting to navigate, and obviously crucially important for farmers and the people that benefit from the work that farmers do. I have a couple of questions off of that before we move on to the next subject. So the first, I'll just ask both at the same time, and then you guys can answer. The first one is, you mentioned that, whether or not it's going to be a dry season or not is going to impact a lot of the decisions that you're making. So I understand that drought can carry kind of from year to year the impacts, but how early is a farmer going to know what future weather might impact, or is it just based on previous years? And then my second question is, when you're planting these crops, I know sometimes there's some overlap in when cover crops and cash crops are grown and sometimes not. So I'm curious, if you're planning to hay these crops, is there a danger of getting residues from the cash crops in that mix? And does that matter? I mean, I assume if the cows are grazing in the field, they're going to eat what they're going to eat anyway. So I imagine they're not just eating the grasses that you planted for them. But does that matter from a hay perspective? And just curious about the practical, how that's done side of things.
Sure. Let me unpackage some of that. So at the time, in the spring of the year, when we might be thinking about fallowing or growing a cover crop, a producer could easily measure how much soil water they have with a soil moisture probe, or brown probe, and that gives you a good idea of what you have to work with, right? So you either have some decent moisture in the profile to grow something, or a lot of years you can barely get the probe in a few inches. And so maybe extremely dry conditions. The other thing that we look at is the long-term weather prediction from the Climate Prediction Center. Unfortunately, they're wrong half the time. So that makes it difficult from a management standpoint. So we know one piece, whether where we have soil water to work with or not. The other, we use that, but recognize that it's not very accurate. And so in our work, what we've been doing is that we have to have the soil moisture and conditions have to look favorable to plant. If those two conditions are not met, we don't plant. And it doesn't eliminate, not some years you should have planted when you don't, and vice versa. But we have seen it improve over a number of years. We have seen it. It does help us make the right choices, whether to plant or not. And we have seen increased profitability a little bit. As far as cattle grazing, cattle will selectively graze. If they're out grazing, they will selectively graze the most palatable part of that plant. And so if there is other residue there, they're not going to graze that. Now you ask the question if you would hay it. If you hay it, of course, all of it is going to get put into a bale. And if that is the case, it can reduce that older residue will be lower in food protein content and lower quality. So that can lower the forage quality of the baled product. Although what we recommend and what we do in our research is we target a 6-inch standing stubble out from haying. So we're not cutting that real close to the ground. And by leaving that more standing stubble there, we're accomplishing a few things. We're keeping that ground covered better to reduce the potential of soil erosion, wind and water erosion being a concern. And then also we are trying to increase the amount of residue we have on the cover, on the soil, to try and reduce soil water evaporation. So we're wanting some of that to keep some of that residue on the soil surface.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, that's super helpful. I wanted to have a better mental picture of how all that pieces together. So thank you for the extra context for the non-scientists in the conversation. So you mentioned already a couple of things related to how this impacts soil, obviously with the erosion and compaction potentials and things like that. So yeah, tell me more about how this impacts the soil.
All right, I guess I'm the soil scientist here, so I'll take this one. So the biggest challenge in grazing these cover crops, most of these are done in crop fields, which are mostly no-till. So the biggest challenge is soil compaction. So you have cattle moving around, trampling, and hoof traffic can potentially cause soil compaction, which will be a bigger issue for our no-till farmers because these producers don't want to till. So grazing cover crop could be a big challenge. And then also, if they remove more above ground biomass, then particularly in our environment that is a semi-arid region, then if you overgraze and remove more soil cover, you expose the soil to wind erosion. The wind blows all the time. So if you remove most of this above ground biomass, that can have significant impact on soil erosion. And then that can impact your soil structure. That can also have an impact on soil organic carbon. So these are big issues that we are trying to address in our research. So like John mentioned, we have been doing these cover crop grazing experiments actually since 2015, looking at if you graze the cover crop versus when you hay the cover crop or you leave it as a true cover crop, what is the impact on the soil? So we've looked at soil compaction. Some of the indicators that we measure for soil compaction, penetration resistance, which is kind of simulating how you kind of push a probe into the soil, simulating how roots, the force that roots we use to move through the soil. And then we also look at bulk density measurements. That is how dense the soil is. So we've been doing this and we found that in general, soil bulk density is not impacted, or soil compaction is not impacted by grazing of these cover crops. But in the review that we did, we saw that at least 50% of the time we seen an increase in soil compaction, like increase in bulk density or increased penetration resistance with grazing of the cover crop. But the good news is that the values that are reported in the literature is less than the values that will impact root growth. For example, if you look at penetration resistance, you need to be around 2 to about 3.5 megapascals to have an impact. Root growth. And most of the work that has been reported in the literature, plus our own work, in our work, we are measuring less than 0.5 megapascals. So that is not a big issue. And soil compaction too is the same, even though if you compare that to the fallow, when you measure bulk density in the fallow plot versus where you graze the crop, it's slightly higher, but it's not having any negative effect on roots because the values are not that high. And then the most important thing or interesting thing that we have found in our research in semi-arid environments, sometimes we don't see an improvement with cover crops in soil organic matter content. They may not be different from the no-till fallow, but what we have seen is actually an increase in aggregate stability with our cover crops, whether we graze the cover crop or we hay the cover crop. And this is something that we think is because of the roots of the cool season grasses, right? So we are grazing these cover crops. So we are not having any impact on the roots. So with that, we are able to keep the soil structure intact. So we've measured in our research, most of the time we see an improvement in aggregate stability with grazing of cover crops. And then what we did in the literature review, most of the time, about 60% of the time, there is no effect of grazing cover crops aggregate stability. And then similarly in soil carbon, we don't see any negative effect. There has been some cases where there has been some decrease in soil organic carbon content, and that would have been where there is excess grazing. So if you increase the stocking rate very high and then you graze it for a longer period, then there's the potential. There'll be some work done in the southeastern United States that show that you can actually decrease soil organic matter content when you graze for a prolonged period of time.
That's awesome. It's great to hear that it is not having negative impacts on soil, or, not enough that it outweighs benefits. That's always lovely to hear. So there's kind of two areas left. We've kind of lightly touched on both of these, but crop yields was one of them. And then just kind of some of the factors that can, help or harm the use of cover crops. So if either of you have anything additional on those two topics, now would be a great time.
Yeah, I think we probably have touched on the crop yields a little bit. In our environment, we work in semi-arid regions. So it depends. The impact on crop yields will probably depend on where you are. But where we are located, water is very important and it's limited. So in years where we have normal precipitation or when it's extremely dry, we don't see any impact. So you grow a cover crop in a wet year, it doesn't have an impact on the subsequent crop yields. Or if it's very dry, everything is almost failing, right? So we don't measure any negative effect on cover crops. So there is some potential to have an negative impact on crop yields. So there has been some additional work that has been done in other places that shows that if you are in a region where you're receiving less than 27 inches of rainfall per year, you kind of have the potential to have a negative effect on crop yields versus where you have more precipitation. So precipitation is kind of the determinant on what will be the impact on the next crop yields in most of the environment that we work in.
I might add, those environments that receive over 27 inches a year, the soils might be wet, saturated a large percentage of the time, and putting cattle out when the field is wet, if you're going to cause compaction, that would be most likely when that would occur. So those real high rainfall areas, you'd want to use some caution, or a little more caution than the drier areas, because you do have that increased potential for having compaction when cattle are out there and the field is saturated. What we advise people to do is if they have native pasture adjacent to crop fields, if we do receive a large precipitation event, to move those cattle off of the crop land on a native pasture for a couple of days to let that soil dry before turning cattle back out on the pasture. They do need to be mindful, but it's probably outside the scope today, about how you manage cattle with grazing and some of the issues of having cattle, that rumen full at time of turnout. So there are some management things, but I think outside of the scope of today, but there are some things to think about.
And I also like to add that with what John mentioned about moving to native pastures. Most of the farmers, we have done on-farm research across Nebraska, Kansas, and then Colorado. Most of the farmers that are grazing cover crops actually some pasture adjacent to the field to make it work. So most of them will probably have the watering area in the pasture. So the cattle will move and go to the pasture to water and then come back to the grazing field. And that limits the amount of compaction that you can have in these crop fields.
Sure. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. If you got to feed them year round, you got to have food sources year round. So good to have somewhere to go besides the crop fields. The next question, we've touched on a few different things that could impact this, but I just want to touch on some of the challenges to implementation for farmers to actually get this started on their farm or as they're working through it. So can you tell me about any other challenges that might face farmers?
Sure, a couple come to mind. One is, not all farmers would have livestock, and vice versa, not all livestock producers have a lot of crop ground. So, what we have found, and I know is occurring in other places, is producers work together. The livestock producer and the crop producer work together, and the livestock producer pays a rent to the crop producer for that extra forage, and then the crop producer also receives extra benefit. So it's a challenge, but also an opportunity, by working together. Another thing to think about or work through, when I would say the renewed interest in cover crops came about when we started doing this work in 2006, there were some government programs, incentives that came along around 2010. And at that time, they did not allow any grazing initially, but thankfully they modified their program to allow livestock grazing. But those programs also vary state by state. So I'm most of them familiar with Kansas, but people will need to check the guidelines for their state. But in Kansas, they allow grazing, and the goal there is to generally take half, leave half of the cover crop. But what we have found is, as I mentioned, and Augustine mentioned, we've seen positive benefits to haying the cover crop. And in that situation, we're actually removing close to 80% of the residue. But keep in mind, we're leaving all of that biomass below the soil surface, plus leaving some extra biomass on top of the soil surface. But and from managing through the wet years and dry years, that's a good way to help bank some forage and insurance policy for those dry years. But currently, the government incentive programs do not recognize haying. But from our research, we have seen haying be a good option from both the soils and economic standpoint. So maybe in time, the government will also revise that program to allow a conservative haying approach. But that is something also to be mindful of.
I love that. I'm so happy to hear about research that can, kind of help improve those programs over time and recommendations over time. Always big fan of that. So you both have been working on this research for a considerable amount of time. So thank you for all of your work you've done on that already. But obviously, as with all research, there's always more to learn. So what are kind of the next steps, either for your team or just broader topics that need more research?
Yeah, so one of the things that we have challenged on, and John touched on, is how much biomass do you have to remove? How much do you leave? We currently don't have that much recommendation. Like John mentioned, take half, leave half is the current recommendation by NRCS. But we've seen that some of these farmers can graze this cover crop, take about 90%. And since you have a cool season or a warm season cover crop, grass, in the mixture, it can actually regrow. So you can have a lot of regrowth, and then you end up having more biomass or similar biomass to if you have not grazed the cover crop. So we have situations where cover crop on-farm study where cover crop biomass after grazing was similar to the cover crop that was not grazed. So if you have that kind of potential for regrowth, then you can possibly graze more and have more animal gain, right? So you are grazing this to get some economic benefit. So that is something that we are working on. We started to have some research projects looking at that. Unfortunately, we have had 2 years of failure. It was so dry we couldn't have that much growth on the cover crop. So we are hoping to collect more data on that. And then one thing we found out through this literature review is apparently there's no more than 5 years of cover crop grazing research. Most of the research done is about 3 years, or the longest will be 5 years of research on cover crop grazing. And we've seen that the results are variable. It varies from year to year. So you want to have long-term experiments to see the cumulative impact of grazing cover crop and soil properties or crop yields. So this is something that is needed. Probably some more funding to support long-term research will be something important to generate more data, especially for dryland environments where crop failure, some years you may not have difficulty in establishing the cover crop. So all these count, right? So you have to do this for a long time to see how these cover crops will work in Ireland.
Augustine did a nice job summarizing many different needs. I would probably just add only one comes to mind, and that is, the very drier regions, maybe where people don't have the moisture to grow a forage in place of fallow, or do not have the livestock in the area. We're exploring a very low seeding rate of a cover to try and increase some residue on the soil surface to get the benefits of growing some cover, but yet not use very much soil water, so that we can try and store soil water for that next subsequent cash crop.
Awesome. Yeah, rich grounds to explore for more research. Love to hear about that. So I have 3 questions left for you. So the first one is, where can people learn more? We'll have the link to your paper, but also just anything about any of the topics you talked about. Where can they go?
Yeah, so most of our work is published in Agronomy Journal or Crop Science or Soil Science Society of America Journal. So that will be the first stop to see. If you Google my name or John's name, we are both on each other's papers. So any of our names will pop out some of the work that we've done on cover crops. So, but you can also go to K-State website. You look at the Agronomy Department research reports. We have a lot of these progress reports on the cover crop grazing work that we've been doing. Most of these reports are carried out by Prairie Press, John, if I'm right. They have them online, so you can have free access to these reports online.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll include links to some of those resources in the show notes as well. Second question is, if people that want to take that next step and get involved in this research, whether that's as a farmer looking to take some first steps, or a researcher, or anyone else, what can they do to get started?
So a good place for producers to start, if they are interested, would be their local NRCS office. There are some other watershed areas and things that also have incentive programs to cover crops, but just about everybody will have, working through the NRCS, will have that would be an option, and there would be some incentives to offset some of the costs of doing this. So that would be a good way to explore some things, to get started, and can build from there. The work that Augustine and I have done is in this semi-arid region where moisture is limited. There's a lot of good work done by others in the Great Plains, as well as other parts of the country, and what our results and the paper results would be applicable to our region. But if people are in a different part of the country, then they may want to look at some work done by other scientists specific for that area.
Sure. Yeah. Great advice for people looking to get started. Last question. What is one fact that people wouldn't know about you if all they had was your research?
That is a tough one, right? So I'm from Ghana. So in Ghana and most parts, we like soccer. So soccer is something that we watch a lot. But apparently when I came to University of Florida, that was the time where we have a very good football team. So I love watching college football. That's something that I do in my pastime. So I love college football. And it's all because I went to University of Florida.
I like college football too. Go Cats. But I would say, people don't know me, my family and I, we have a livestock and farming operation as well. So I've actually grown these cover crops, had cattle out on cover crops. So seen both ends of this spectrum, from the research side to actually making it work, and we're continuing to do it. So I would encourage people to give it a go.
Awesome. Well, those are some delightful fun facts. Always love that question. So thank you so much for all of your time today and for all the work that you've done on this research for multiple decades, and also as a farmer on the other side. But yeah, thank you so much to both of you for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Tanner. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Hi, Abby. I appreciate you having me on today. My name is Tanner Judd, and I am a PhD candidate here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I grew up in Northeast Ohio and attended West Virginia University, where I got my undergraduate degree in agroecology in 2020. I then went on to Oklahoma State University, where I got a master's degree in plant and soil sciences, graduating in 2022. And I'm now in my third year here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Soil Sciences, where Doctors Matt Ruark and Zach Friedman are my co-advisors.
Wonderful. And what are you currently researching?
So my research interests fall under the categories of soil health and fertility. In my most recent project, I'm quantifying manure nitrogen uptake in cover crops using an isotopic approach. In short, what this means is by feeding 15N labeled urea or plant material to dairy cattle, we can then produce 15N labeled manure, which essentially serves as an isotopic dye to trace manure nitrogen through the plant soil system. The main priority here is gaining a nuanced understanding of nitrogen dynamics when manure is fall applied with non-legume cover crops, because we know that this practice has an opportunity for reducing nitrogen losses from the system along with other benefits. I'm following where the manure nitrogen goes in the soil, how much ends up in the cover crop, and eventually when does it become available to the next cash crop in the following year. So in the big picture, this is all pertinent information to advancing the state of manure nitrogen management with cover crops for maximizing both the economic and ecological benefits while also limiting any environmental drawbacks.
Great. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that look like?
So a dream project for me is actually more about who I'm working for and with more than what I'm doing, actually. I'm always striving for my research to be driven by the interests and needs of the agricultural producers. So on-farm research is just one example of types of projects that I'd always want to be involved in. I've loved the opportunities that I've had so far to be involved and attend producer-centered conferences and extension events. And just I've learned a lot listening to what agricultural producers and other members of that community have to say. There's just a lot for me to learn. So I have a lot of respect for the work and challenges that those members face in the agricultural community, and it would be a privilege for me to continue working with and serving that community throughout my research career.
Awesome. Well, if you'd like to get in touch with Tanner about his work, we'll have his contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.